to the Scaling Japan podcast, a podcast about how to grow your business from $100,000 and beyond in the land of the rising sun.
Welcome to the Scaling Japan podcast. I'm your host, Tyson Batino, and on today's episode, we have Vincent Nicol for a second time. Vincent is a co-founder at GourmetPro, the largest food and beverage consulting network in Japan, and hopefully soon Asia, and has more than 15 years of experience in the food and beverage space in Japan. We have Vincent as a guest to talk about distribution channels in Japan last time, like licensing, joint ventures, and distribution agreements. But for today, we will focus on how to do crowdfunding in Japan in the context of a market entry tactic. So very glad to have you on the episode again, Vincent.
Yes, hi Tyson, hi everyone. Thanks a lot for inviting me again. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you and your community.
Yeah, I'm really glad to have you for a second episode. And I was really curious and intrigued when I heard about using crowdfunding as a technique for your market entry, I guess, in probably the context of seeing if there's a good product market fit. But before we dive into that part, I think we can just start from the beginning. What is crowdfunding?
Just introducing a little bit the topic also on my side. My experience with this is that with GourmetPro, we had lots of focus on market entry for food and beverage companies. And we always see this crowdfunding, as you mentioned, as one of the, let's say, the creative channel for market entry. I would like to focus today the discussion mostly on my own experience, my own practice around this. So I will try to give, as much as example as possible. And before we dive, I also invite everyone to spend some time, checking by themselves a little bit, because I'm going to explain this a little bit, but the landscape is very dynamic and very interesting at the moment. So yes, what is crowdfunding? I think everyone understands that this is a way to finance new projects or new businesses through a collective of individuals usually. And I think most of your community is familiar with the top platforms as Kickstarter, Indiegogo, which are leading platforms in many markets. In Japan, the crowdfunding is basically a local ecosystem. It's a big focus on reward-based crowdfunding. So basically receiving a reward in return for their donation. Just to explain a little bit about, the alternative, there are also donation-based crowdfunding, which is really a minority in Japan. And this is not our topic today, but there is also equity-based crowdfunding, which is a different topic. So basically, when it's come to the reward-based crowdfunding, and just to come back to the definition of the overall crowdfunding, for me, most of the business in Japan is basically a kind of modern adaptation of the yoyaku hanbai, which is pre-sales, basically. I think, you understand that. In the Japanese context, there is lots of interest for exclusivity, exclusive products, limited quantity, seasonal edition, etc., etc. And there used to be this huge kind of, gift and catalog business. And to me, somehow, this reward-based crowdfunding will be better defined by a modern pre-sales system where basically there is a transactional relationship where it's less about a donation and then a reward in return, but it's more directly, the process of purchasing a product in advance and be delivered, a few months later. So somehow, it means also that this is not, for this reason, always the best way to raise investment for new projects from scratch. But instead, as you said, a great channel to test product and to start your market entry journey in Japan. And that's basically my point of view and my experience with these crowdfunding platforms.
I think that was a great way of explaining it, because I think when most people think of reward-based crowdfunding platforms, they think of, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, and someone's launching a project. It could probably be their minimal viable product, or it could be the second edition, which is actually true in Japan. But there's also cases where companies that have an established product, they can offer kind of a special campaign as well to boost additional sales, to reach target markets that they originally haven't reached. And in my personal experience, I've helped a Kickstarter campaign, and I've had a friend who did a really successful Makuake campaign. And I've done a Ready For campaign personally. And for the Ready For campaign, I wouldn't say it was a huge success, but we're able to get some sales for an existing product that wasn't like prototype level.
Very important point, I think, like especially for the founders who are listening to us today, who might think that this could be also a way to test, like as you say, a prototype. I can tell you that at GourmetPro, for example, our experts who've been like designing and executing this kind of campaigns, and myself, screening like dozens and hundreds of campaigns. Sounds to us that no one basically started working with this platform without having a product already developed, and I would say like almost ready to push the button for the manufacturing. It's extremely rare to see cases where people are really trying to test a concept. Usually, let's say that the business is 70% ready to launch, and somehow the crowdfunding campaign is a way to just jump in the market, as you described.
Yeah, in the case of my friend who did have a success at Makuake, they did have a very good success as a prototype, but for their benefit, they were selling digital version of a game that exists in Japan, and they created a digital version of it. So they already had a fan base of people who played this game and they really wanted to see a digital version. Therefore, they supported the prototype. And for that reason, they're able to sell, I think, several hundreds at more than 10,000 yen per device.
Wow, well done.
In their case, they had a network and it was people who were very passionate about the product. And so they weren't starting at zero. So I don't think their case like applies to all products.
Okay, interesting.
So I think, Makuake, Ready For, and I think Campfire. So I think there's different types. So like what types of companies and organizations can utilize crowdfunding?
I think like this really changed over time. As you just mentioned, I think like that was very attractive first for, let's say, ventures, people who already have a business, they want to test a new market, they want to test a new category sometimes, they want to test potentially also a new consumer group, for example. In Japan, in the last years, interestingly, we see that now also the largest companies are launching products through Makuake, for example. It was the case last year with large innovation for Suntory, which is a canned wine. They launch exclusively on Makuake. We've seen this like a few times already, so that it feels that there is also a trend for these large companies to use the crowdfunding platform again as a market entry tactic. I think like what is interesting also is to see like traditional businesses, especially in the food and beverage, we can see that there is this kind of 10th generation sake breweries who are probably now managed by a younger generation, and they are trying to modernize a little bit their business using Makuake also as a way to reach new consumer groups. Another type of business, and I think like that will make sense for this type of businesses, is people who are really into building a direct-to-consumer business. So there are plenty of cases here where actually part of the largest now food and beverage D2C businesses, they start their journey on Makuake, on Campfire, sometime, with one very successful campaign. Sometimes they keep using the crowdfunding platform as a way to keep connecting with their audience and also to test new products. And more recently, we've seen also these direct-to-consumer businesses trying to go into partnership, kind of like collabs with other brands. And somehow, they are also reaching the other brand audience probably doing this kind of campaign. So I think like the landscape really changed from the crowdfunding platform being originally very relevant for the startups, let's say. And now, as explained, we see lots of different players, including, as I mentioned, the large companies and the traditional businesses. So it's a very dynamic market at the moment. Based on my experience, looking also at the project that we've been supporting with GourmetPro, I think like this is relevant for any kind of businesses. If the usage of the platform is well integrated as part of a market entry strategy, as part of a go-to-market strategy.
Now I understand what you meant by pre-sales and yoyaku hanbai, meaning like, in Suntory's case, they could do like kind of like a catalog, or they might do through a service where they can sell a lot of things like, let's say, probably a new product or a seasonal product. But now they could just do it online.
Exactly, yes. So maybe just to build on this a little bit, like why those companies are doing this, I think like based on what we already discussed, of course, it's not to raise fund, of course, for those companies. It's, of course, for them, it could be a way to do pre-sales with a positive cash flow. I think like this is more relevant for smaller companies. Suntory do not need, a few million Japanese yen in sales for their P&L, surely. But even for Suntory, I think like that's a kind of flexible way also to do a test market. It's too late for them, when they come to the market doing this kind of like crowdfunding campaign on Makuake, they already decided that they will launch the product for sure. But even though I think like in terms of what they can test, there are a few things that are actually very important in my views around, for example, the ability to test copies, claims, visuals, this kind of, different communication angles, for example. It's also a way to test which demographics were mostly interested in the product. It's also a way to collect some consumer feedbacks during the campaign or after the campaign, for example. And also it's a tool for small companies, it's a tool for like PR, really like public relation. For a large company like Suntory, I can tell you that it's something they do also for their own trade story, which is actually having one slide on a PowerPoint when they are meeting like top retailers, when they are meeting like wholesalers, etc. They want to position the product in a way that it will be basically like seen as a modern product appealing to, let's say, modern consumers. And they are likely to do a page on their big success on Makuake, for example. So even for large companies, this is relevant. Of course, for smaller companies, this is exactly the kind of information that will be highlighted and communicated to potential retailers after the campaign.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Scaling Japan. In addition to serving as your fine host, I also provide advisory and coaching services to business owners who want to 2x, 5x, and even 10x their business. So stop holding your company and your team and your employees back, and let me help you and your company scale. Find more information at scalingyourcompany.com. Now back to the episode. I wanted to dive deeper into the part about like smaller businesses using it as a PR strategy, because I know the traditional PR strategy is you might use like prtimes.co.jp. PR Times is the cheap one. Yep. So just to make that clear, other ones like I think are definitely more expensive, but you do the press release after the success.
Yes, could be both actually, could be combined. That's exactly the kind of tactics that we had in the past and still now, where it could be like one press release that will tell about like the Makuake campaign, for example. During the campaign, to keep building the momentum, there could be a second press release, saying how successful and how crazy it is. And then it could be like another press release. Of course, if it's PR Times, it's still like a small investment. There could be like different channels for this, but this is a way also to show the reality of a launch. For lots of companies, sometimes it's a pre-launch and that's the first time they will be really able to say that, it's happening in the market. And it's also a way to keep like the people around, like the stakeholders, for example, engaged with the project. I've seen this many times where it feels like suddenly the fact that it's on Makuake or on Campfire, it makes it feel extremely real for all the people who supported the project so far.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And I think one other thing you mentioned too that got my attention was, I'll phrase this in the form of a question, but do retailers look at Makuake and other crowdfunding platforms to discover new products to sell?
Yes. Yes. So it depends on the retailers, of course. What is interesting is that somehow Makuake is competing against Isetan, against Marui, against maybe, let's say the leading department stores. If you think about what we just discussed, limited edition, exclusivity, it's kind of like pre-sales, catalog sales, etc. It's interesting because that was the department store business. If you think about, the Osebo kind of, year-end gift, etc. Somehow, the people are now buying these kind of things on Makuake, even if it's not, exactly the same and not the direct alternative. But in terms of the purchase motivation, there are lots of things in common. And I can tell you for sure that those retailers, the buyers, for example, working for the department stores, will screen all the products sold on Makoake. Same for like in the food business, clearly it's the same for the high-grade supermarket, upscale supermarket, for example. Seijoishi, Kinokuniya, those buyers, they will look at, what is happening on those platforms. I'm less familiar, with the other categories, but I'm quite sure that, for example, the Don Quixote kind of, variety store buyer is looking also at what is happening in the tech or design, interior also space for the same reason.
Yeah, not sure if they copy products, but moving to a different topic, I can definitely see Tokyo Hands having a big procurement department and looking for new and novel things. I used to go to Tokyo Hands when I lived down in Kanto to just look at what they had and go on a discovery. When you're mentioning food, like I thought about Seijoishi as well. I think that's like you can that they're looking
for real. It's really like kind of the feedback I get also from people who did that and were really contacted also after by those retailers. Yeah. Just a small comment also on those platforms. What is interesting also is that now some of the retailers are developing their own crowdfunding platforms, for example. It's been here for a long time, but Parco, for example, is partnering, I think, with Campfire. One of the leading wholesaler, Kokubu, developed their own crowdfunding platform, for example. So this is also a space where they are not just looking at it for the trends, but or to source new products, but they are also looking at this as a way to not only build new business, but again, to take more leadership around product testing, I think.
I think it's really interesting to see how it's evolving. And one other thing before we move on, I want to clarify for the listeners as well is I'm not sure about it so much nowadays. Maybe Vincent might know, but I know that MPOs would so often like do a campaign. They would give something in return, of course, but they would use it as a method of collecting funds. So it wouldn't be just like, a pure donation. They'll do something in return. Like, they might write you a thank you note, send you a picture, or if like they're trying to create like a huge garden, they'll send you some food. So I know that has been used for that method as well. Vincent, you mentioned 3 platforms, Makoake, Campfire, and Ready4. Which of those platforms are good for what business types?
Basically, I think like when it comes to these top 3 platforms, I think like they are relevant for most businesses. The difference is that, let's say, Makoake is now more popular. They are running more campaigns. I think like the average sales is higher than the other platform. Again, I mean, if you are, a founder like willing to test it, please spend some time also on online looking at this information, in depth, because that might depend also on your category, of course. In the food and beverage business, Makoake is more attractive. There were like lots of success stories on Makoake with campaigns raising more than 20 million Japanese yen, for example. Ready4 is less relevant for food and beverage. My experience is that possibly when it's come to the tech, for example, like gaming, etc., or the kind of like gadget business also, which is quite developed, on this platform, I think that Campfire is more relevant. And then maybe it will be good also to look across the demographics. I have an image of Makoake being more relevant for male in their 30, 40, for example. Probably less follow from women shoppers, for example. So I think like good to look at the information. I think like most of the platforms are disclosing these informations. On top of those 3 platforms, by the way, also there are lots of new emerging platforms that are worth also analyzing. Even like excluding, the equity-based crowdfunding, which is a different topic. In the entertainment, for example, there is one platform, for example, Bridge, which is supporting up-and-coming artists, where it could be like sometimes very much like micro-influencers. And this is very interesting also because if you are in this industry, you will be able to reach a completely different segment of consumers who are really looking at supporting, emerging artists, for example. There are like plenty of examples like this. I think, I don't know exactly the number, but there are more like than 30 platforms at the moment. So depending on your category also, I invite you also to have a look and kind of dive into platform that may be niche, but possibly also more relevant for your product, for your project.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think my experience working with my friend who was working in a real niche, like there's possibly less than 1 million people who plays that game. But because the niche is so strong, you'll get a lot more support than doing something for the general market. But that makes total sense about, let's say, more niche crowdfunding services popping up, because I could see someone doing a campaign, not getting much results, and feel like they would like to help people not go through the same fate as them.
For like huge successes, it's clear that the first like 100 shoppers were basically people who are already on the platform. And then those people or external people were able to gather a much broader community of people who are not necessarily registered on the platform. So the more you go into this kind of niche platform, even if you have just a follow from a dozen of early supporters, you might be able to generate, enough interest so that they will basically like spread the campaign, across the network and bring much more people, supporting the campaign. I think like that's quite common also in Japan. And just coming back also, Tyson, to your example about the MPO, I'm not very familiar with this category of campaign, of course, but we've seen this also sometimes with local campaign where it's really about like supporting the revitalization of a city, for example. And we will see that, the local community will be very much involved in this, in the success of the campaign, even if they were not like just the regular, let's say, Makuake or whatever platform, users. They will be also able to bring people from the outside. So I think like go for the niche sometime, or at least test it. I think like could be good to have sometime a strategy where you have like 2 campaigns with 2 different products and do a real like A/B test, targeting different audiences, also with different messages. Why not?
Yeah, it kind of opened my eyes as well listening to that. There actually might be a lot more options. It's just people don't talk about it because it's more niche. So I think your recommendations for people to really dive into their niche is excellent feedback. And I think the other thing that I really took too is, let's say, the original crowdfunding, it's really evolved quite a bit. Like, let's say there's different channels, but also I think things that would have normally been crowdfunding, some have turned to their own like platform site to sell things. Like one is, I think, farmers selling direct to consumers now. And I could see that kind of evolving from farmers trying to sell on a crowdfunding campaign.
Exactly, yes.
And so cool. No, yeah, I think you've provided a lot of great context on crowdfunding. And for listeners, in the future, I would like to do an episode on crowdfunding for stocks in your company, or equity, the more technical term. But yeah, for more on like, let's say the B2B or like B2C crowdfunding type, Vincent, because you've been involved in a lot of successful campaigns, I would like you to share some of your tips for creating a successful crowdfunding campaign in Japan.
Okay, so yeah, I think like there is different things, one is more like the design aspect of it. I've seen like campaigns that were extremely successful with a great strategy, and some of the campaigns which were successful, without a great strategy, and the opposite is true as well. So it's sometimes difficult to understand, what will be the successful campaign, and sometimes there is assumption that the category will be attractive, for example, or that the product or the project will be catchy enough to appeal the kind of shoppers that are on those platforms. But there is, of course, a part of uncertainty and a part of magic. The thing is, for us, especially like, at GourmetPro, with our expert also like running different campaigns, if we look at this, with kind of a 360-degree perspective, we kind of understand that there are some principles to be successful. And maybe I can start from the usual mistakes, let's say, which is assuming that quick and dirty will be enough. I think like this is not true. It used to be the case before. Now there is too much campaigns. There are campaigns like starting every 10 minutes, every day. You need to be really strong at the campaign execution. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect is more like on the design part, the strategy part. Spending time on research is critical. And I've seen like a few businesses who assume that their products were so unique that they don't have to look at, what was done before somehow. Or again, believing in their product superiority somehow. I think like here, just do it the right way, where it's spending the appropriate time on doing research, which is very simple. Basically, it's screening, all the different campaigns organized on the different platforms, similar to your product or your project. Also, ideally, kind of like inputting a few numbers, get a sense of the number of supporters, but also like the average basket kind of, people used to buy different sets, so that there is one set at 5,000, for example, 10,000, 15,000, etc. It's good to go through this, and analyze that, because you might be surprised. For example, what I can tell you is that usually the more expensive sets are sold out first, so that you will assume that you need to be affordable, but actually your first sales will come from people who are affluent enough sometimes or interested enough to just buy the most expensive set. I think that's quite common. Then why not also like just doing a few phone calls, to the people around you, typically Tyson, your community also, I think like people can also connect a little bit and share, their experience on the previous campaign they did. It's good to have a real feedback, because the success of the campaign will be also a lot about like designing it the right way with the right resource. So let's maybe move to the execution part. I think like what you need first is people with expertise and experience. So it's not something that you can do it by yourself, of course. The success rate might be lower. It could be a great experience for you. But if you really need this to be a success, I really invite you to reach out specialist. If you are in the food business, obviously our expert at GourmetPro will be happy to help you. But could be like also you reaching out to copywriters, designers, etc., etc. What is really important is to spend enough time on the copywriting part. The story should be very compelling. I've seen like businesses who kind of assume that they will just translate their, again, quick starter in a campaign in Japanese and that will be fine. Not at all. You need to not only adapt, but really like craft a story which will be relevant in the Japanese context. If you have money to spend, like just spend most of the money on copywriting. And then there are a few things to do right, which is the designs of the banners, for example. How are you going to introduce, your products, the price, key message, for example. And then there are a few things that you need to do during the campaign, which is about like how to build momentum. What we just discussed actually, which is there a way that you, for example, you can use the platform to send messages every 2-3 days? You can like just share some updates, for example. The press release, what we just discussed, keeping like building news, for example. After a few days, send a mailing to all your network, explaining that you already reached your objective, for example, in 2 days, and you still have like 2 weeks or 1 month, to make it more successful. So there are lots of different things you can do, and it's good that you kind of plan it from the beginning. It's a little bit too late, when you have to decide. Of course, there will be like some surprise, but it's good to have like already your scenario where you know that, okay, if I'm going to be sold out the first day, how can I keep building momentum on this, etc., etc. So I think like it's 50-50 between the importance of the strategy and the kind of the good design in terms of like designing the campaign. I didn't mention it, but here also, obviously, the pricing will be really important, especially if you are launching a product on those platforms. You want also your pricing to be consistent with your future pricing, for sure, in the more regular channel, let's say, or on your like kind of direct to consumer channel, why not? And then the execution, which is a lot about building the campaign in the right way through design, copywriting, etc., etc. Could be like videos also, could be content, which is more like personal also sometimes. And then it's really having a plan where day 1, day 2, day 3, you already know what you are going to do or what you will do in case it's more or less successful than you saw. These kind of basic things are critical, to be successful.
Have you ever found yourself having trouble creating a business plan? Do you pretty much operate on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis, creating confusion and chaos in your organization? If that sounds like you, I recommend you join my Entrepreneur Bootcamp. In my bootcamp, you will set an achievable but challenging revenue target for the current or following fiscal year, and we will create a business plan to make it a reality. See more in the show notes below. And now back to our episode. No, they are extremely critical, and I would like to dive a little bit more into it. I think one important question to ask before to provide more context is, how much do these crowdfunding services charge?
So it's depending on the platform, but it's in between usually 12% to 20% of the sales. They will take this as a markup. And sometimes they will charge some extra also if you want them to do advertising, for example. So typically Makwake, they have this kind of like retargeting system. If you have experience with this by yourself, you don't need to use the platform, but sometimes you might use the platform services because you don't have time to build your own retargeting campaign, for example. Based on our experience, it's not very effective, actually. The return on investment is not great. That will be additional cost, possibly around 200,000 yen, for example, for one additional campaign. Makwake is taking 20%. I think Campfire used to take like 15 and now probably like 17. And Ready For, I need please check, but I think it should be around also the same kind of level, yeah.
Excellent. And the reason I asked you that question is it actually brings me to a common misconception that people have, and which I initially had about crowdfunding as well, is that because these companies are actually taking, or I think it's a really large amount, like 12 to 20%, considering that probably the credit card charge is 3 to 3.5%. Let's say if you exclude that, they're taking around 8, in some cases like 16%. And in return for that, a normal person doing a crowdfunding is expecting that they're actually going to bring eyeballs to your project because that's what you're paying them for. And one funny way I described it is like they're probably the most expensive version of Shopify.
Yes.
With Shopify, you're responsible for bringing your own customers. They provide the platform at a lower price. So if you use Shopify and then you end up using like a crowdfunding, like you're like, okay, I'm paying more money, so I'm going to get something in return. But I think that's probably one of the biggest reasons why people fail is that they actually assume that's what they're getting in return. Where I more like to say is they are a glorified version of Shopify. Vincent, you mentioned a really great point. It's 50% is the campaign, the visuals you mentioned, the storytelling, the copywriting. But the other 50% is momentum and taking responsibility for bringing eyeballs to your campaign and maintaining it. And I think a lot of companies, especially the ones that try to use it with hopeful eyes, they just don't have that knowledge internally.
No, very, very good point. I think like that's a common, misunderstanding, which leads to frustration also, exactly the way you describe it. I think the platform in some cases will be able to bring the initial traffic. Sometimes it's very successful. We didn't talk about like the shopper profile, but they are also on those platforms kind of, I don't know if I should say it this way, but like compulsive shoppers, like there will be always like 20, 30 shoppers who will just buy during the first hours. That's what the platform can bring you also, is this ability also to reach this kind of highly, let's say, motivated shoppers. But sometimes that's not your target. Sometimes they are like just people willing to buy any kind of new product, and they are not going to build, again, as we say, additional traffic. They are not going to spread the word around them, to promote your campaign as well. So now exactly, I think like take responsibility of your own campaign. Of course, this is frustrating because you can feel like, why should I pay like 15%, 20%? But at least you have a frame. You have like specific rules. You can reach, at least part of the audience which is on this platform. And I will say, like, more importantly, even in the case where you are able to generate all the traffic, for example, I think like having your campaign on this kind of very well-established platform is also a way to make the people very being confident about spending their dollars on a product which is not even yet released, have the confidence that the product will be shipped and they will receive it, in a few weeks or in a few months, which is not the case, if you do it by yourself. This feeling about like feeling safe about the platform, I think is also one of the major benefits of using those platforms, in my opinion.
In my case, you can maybe feel like the frustration I had, like, what? I'm paying these guys this much money and I'm doing all the work for distribution. And that was a fair point because in our case too, like where I've helped, it did provide a little bit of initial sales from, let's say, probably the compulsive buyers. But it was really us doing a lot of work. And I think one other thing, just to provide a fair viewpoint, is if you ask their staff, or at least this was the case like 5 years ago, the staff would try to give you tips and feedback on best practices, but don't expect them to be the pros. The pros is the ones who's making more money.
Exactly. No, especially now, I think like, the campaigns, they are overwhelmed with lots of businesses just willing to use those platforms. So the support is really like the minimum. And it's even like frustrating because sometimes they ask you like tons of questions you need to justify. any kind of claims that you have in your storytelling. For example, if you just want to say that you are number one, or it's the first time you release this product, they will ask you for certificates, etc., etc. So it's even more frustrating actually now. Yet this is the place to be. And in 70% of the cases, I think like people who try that were happy with the result. And some of the companies we've been supporting, they keep using this not only as a market entry tactics, but more like as a way to keep building interest and to keep also testing concept. As I mentioned, for many direct to consumer business, this is still the best way to give it a try and to reach, the consumer for the first time. So let's be positive about this. One important part of this is also like building the price structure and the pricing in a way that it's not going to be a huge burden for you that you have to release like 20%. So maybe you have to twist a little bit like the quantities, etc., etc. And I can tell you also, based on my experience, that it's not extremely profitable, of course. It's good for the net sales, but when it's come to the net income, of course, usually you don't make much money at the end. If you get like 10% margin at the end of the day, that's fair,
Cool. No, thank you for bringing me up to speed on crowdfunding. I thought you did a very good job of explaining use cases that it could be very useful for, and maybe other use cases that maybe you need to consider a bit more. Finishing things off, could you let the audience know where they can find you?
So GourmetPro, we are very active on LinkedIn. So I will definitely recommend you to just find us on LinkedIn and the message. We have also our GourmetPro website. Just to clarify also how the GourmetPro expert can help you, it's not only like just like running a crowdfunding campaign. It's more about the ability also to support you for your overall market entry, where the crowdfunding campaign could play a role, and it will be both around the strategy and the execution. We have also lots of specialists when it's come to copywriting, design, branding, etc., who can help with the execution as well.
And I know you guys are really kicking butt in helping companies sell food and beverage products in Japan, but I think you guys are expanding to APAC as well, right?
Exactly, yes. Exactly, especially in top markets and in South Korea at the moment, yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much, Vincent.
Thank you.